This is a case study of a gifted child. The child is Maddie by Drew Spires, Dr. Andrew B. Spires. All right, so first of all, let's start with Maddie's test scores, some work samples, and some observations based on some interviews. Her test scores, she didn't have a lot of test scores. We'll get into where she went to school, but there was a 4th to 8th grade gap of time where she did not take any standardized tests at all. So if we look at her state assessments, we see a few on this. We see 2 on this graph in particular. Her 3rd grade, her last CRCT grade, which was in the spring of 2013. You can see the red star. She was significantly above average, both for her school, which was a high-performing school here in DeKalb County, and definitely above the state average. And then there's the gap. And then you see her end of course grade, one of her end of course grades, grade 9, 2019. And she's way above the state and school average. And she's at a high performing school as well. So those are 2 of her state scores. We see some more test scores, some EOC, some milestones, CRCT back in the day when we had CRCT. And you see the vast majority of her grades are exceeds distinguished learner. So well above average. A couple exceptions, a little bit of style back in 3rd grade for writing. Also, she did her accelerated algebra geometry course. She kind of had a bad 9th grade experience, not in terms of peer group, but just in terms of not connecting with the teacher and just kind of having a bad experience. So, and her math performances became exceeds and distinguished as she moved forward. So. All right, let's look at a couple more test grades or test scores for Maddie. You see her achievement is distinguished and, certainly above average percentile-wise for her MAP scores for reading and language, and for math and reading and language 2018, 2019. So once again, a lot of distinguished, a lot of above average. Once again, mathematics, according her ACT college readiness score was above average, but not quite in that distinguished area. But once again, that was that 9th grade year that she kind of had a rough transition in terms of her math. So after that 9th grade year, everything was distinguished above average for her county test scores, for the MAP testing, and for the state testing. Let's look at a couple of work samples. This was actually in my accelerated pre-calculus class, which is a class of majority gifted learners and a few students who are not labeled gifted. You can see her work for this. Not only is this a very rigorous type of problem, but this was her first iteration of it. Usually, I would teach something. We would have kind of not a lecture, but more of a, let me show you a little bit about this type of problem, and then students would practice. And this is a high concept and high procedural problem. So it's very rigorous in that it's multi-step. They have to understand a lot of concepts, but they also have to have a lot of background with numbers, with square roots, with fractions. So generally one of our more difficult problem types. And this was her first attempt at it, and she just knocked it out of the water. For example, if you look at the sketch that she made, both of her sketches involve the ordered pair. For example, number 1, the ordered pair is, we see -3, 2. And when she labeled her diagram, a lot of students, a common mistake is they label the base of the triangle -3 because that's the actual coordinate, but the actual length you see is +3, which it should be. So the length is +3 even though you're moving left. And then the height is the y coordinate, which in this case is 2. And then she found r. She actually labeled theta, which is the angle in this situation. A lot of common mistakes are the angles inside the triangle. That's a tough transition for a lot of students. She labeled theta in standard position going into the second quadrant, so the angle theta is actually on the outside of the triangle. So there are a lot of things going on in these 2 problems, and she did them all remarkably well. This these two problems consist of 4 weeks of learning in pre-calculus and trigonometry, plus years and years of learning in terms of evaluating radical expressions, simplifying fractions. So this is just something that shows her depth of knowledge and her understanding of mathematics. If we go to the next two problems, exact same thing, just a wealth of understanding, good notation, ability to just learn a really tough concept really quickly and demonstrate that learning on so many levels with her work. Not to mention her work is just very neat. So very impressed. This is just one work sample of something we did early in the semester. So my observations of her, she's on the cross-country team, and I'm the cross-country coach. So I met her I've known her for 2 years now prior to her being in my class this semester virtually. So some of my observations are great sense of humor, super witty, super kind, really kind with all the other runners, especially the younger runners. An intense work ethic. She works really hard. Her intrapersonal skills and her interpersonal skills, in my observation, are fantastic. So her learning profile. She took 3 surveys and inventories. The DVC was the first, the Learning Style Survey. So this was interesting. So I actually printed this and gave it to her. She gave it back to me, and then I entered the results. And she was really a strong learner in all. Some students tend to be really strong in one and weak in the others. And if you look at her results, whether it's visual, verbal, tactile, kinesthetic, auditory, verbal, they're all really high. The tactile kinesthetic, it was interesting, was the highest. So I'll talk a little bit about that one. As abstract as my math class is, I like to think of it as very kinesthetic, because students aren't just sitting passively listening to lectures. They're doing, not only are they taking notes and annotating, but we are constantly stopping. So generally, if I'm doing direct instruction, which I try not to do all the time, but when I do, the students are actively engaged, meaning they're actually manipulating, they're taking notes, they're annotating, and then I'll stop and let students spend a good 5-10 minutes working through a problem together and by themselves, ask questions. So it's much more guided instruction when it's direct instruction and not lecture. So these are the attributes of the tactile kinesthetic learner. It's very hands-on. Students, they're definitely, I encourage in-class demonstrations by students. So we examine student work. Students do a lot of working together and a lot of sharing out. So even though it's a math class, in my opinion, it's much more tactile kinesthetic than any of the other learning styles. Okay, and so I actually went through the strategies for teaching a tactile kinesthetic learner, and I just kind of highlighted a few things that she mentioned through interviews and through these surveys. She likes to jot down keywords and draw pictures, which is highly encouraged by our annotated note-taking process in class. She likes to read information aloud. That kind of helps her learn, which is interesting. I like that. I'm kind of the same way. She does make flashcards for a lot of her classes. And also she likes to listen to audio recordings while she exercises. She runs cross country. She plays basketball. So she exercises for 30 minutes to an hour, sometimes 2 hours on a daily basis. And so she, a lot of times when she's doing this by herself, will listen to music and audio recordings. So to continue the learning profile, the next learning profile was a multiple intelligence inventory, and she took a multiple intelligence survey. So I'm actually going to toggle between those two, because those two, the inventory and the survey, really had the same results. So according to the multiple intelligence inventory, her strongest strength, and they were all pretty much strengths in my opinion, was the logical part. And then, so that's the inventory. And if you look at the survey, you see that math was her strongest. So the math, or what they call in the other, the logical, those were definitely her strongest. And as a math teacher, I see that. She has definitely strengths in those areas, logic, math. All right, so looking back at the multiple intelligence inventory, her next strongest was intrapersonal strength, which certainly I notice as well. And if you look at her multiple intelligence survey, self was the next strongest. So those mirrored each other. Two different, a different survey and a different profile, a different inventory, but they showed basically the same information. Okay. Continuing with that, I do want to emphasize there was one strength that was, kind of her weakest was her musical ability. So she put that, through the inventory, you see you have some 60s and some 70s, but 50 was the musical strength, and that was definitely, according to the survey, also it scored the lowest. So you have math and self were really strong, a lot in the middle. She's a strong learner, but ultimately these were kind of queued up in order. And then you see music as the lowest, so I thought that was interesting. All right, so we had 4 different interviews going on, and through those 4 interviews, I was able to kind of see a lot about her family and her background, which a lot of this I knew from coaching her as well. So I'll just discuss certain snippets of those conversational interviews via email and conversation. So my interview with Maddie, she has a younger brother. She has 2 parents, happily married, in the house. She's been in the same house her entire life. She went to Briar Lake Elementary, kindergarten through 3rd grade, which is in her neighborhood, so she, it's close enough where she could basically walk to school. And then for 4th grade through 8th grade, she went to In Town, which is a private school. I wish I had had more conversations, but because of virtual training and virtual classrooms, and with her being it being her junior year, I didn't want to have 2 interviews, 3 interviews, 4 interviews. I wanted to respect her time. So I didn't get a background for why she went to In Town instead of continuing with Briar Lake in the middle school. But then she did come back to Lakeside, which is our public school here and where I teach. So she's been there for 9th, 10th, and now her junior year. So that's a little bit of her background and her family. Maddie remembers starting the gifted program in 1st grade. And the first time she ever had a strong realization that she's in this gifted program, like this means something, was in 3rd grade when they would do pull-out discovery, and she remembered it being really challenging. But even though it was really challenging, really difficult, she really enjoyed it. It was much more on the science side, which is she doesn't feel confident in science, which I find interesting. But she definitely, so she excels in math. She feels good about all her other core subject areas, and then feels like of the core subject areas, science is the class she feels least confident about, which I found interesting. Interviewing her mom said a lot of the same things. She's always enjoyed learning. Her mom does know that. She's always been self-motivated. She's always been just driven to do well. Her mother never had to stay on her about getting work done, or her mom does remember the pull out in 3rd grade with the discovery. There was no gifted at In Town for grades 4 through 8, but mom said that it was a very advanced curriculum, and so she always felt like Maddie was being challenged, even though, there weren't gifted versus non-gifted classes. And she really noticed the difference with gifted in high school, that her high school gifted classes are much more rigorous, that she's challenged more, that she's more engaged in those classes. Her mom also made an interesting comment that she's glad that, being in gifted classes, she's grouped with other students who value learning. I thought that was an interesting comment. I've noticed that over the last 20 years that gifted classes tend to be, for lack of a better term, just kind of havens for students who have parents who want them to be in classes with students who are working hard, taking their studies seriously, and that's a separate conversation for another time. So I thought that comment was interesting. Okay, and then I interviewed two of Maddie's teachers, a social studies teacher from last year and a math teacher from last year. They both said the same thing, that she grasps concepts quickly, that she's self-motivated. Her social studies teacher did say that she really didn't seem very engaged verbally, but that doesn't mean she wasn't engaged. She just didn't share out a lot in class. And he said that even though she was very quiet in class and didn't actually share out during some of the discussions, that she was a very conscientious student, which goes along with what her mom says and just what I see as a math teacher. So to kind of synthesize a lot of the things I saw, her strengths, whether perceived or not, definitely I see her as a strong math logic student. I see her. She's great with people. She has a great understanding of herself. She's very self-motivated, very conscientious. Weaknesses, I put science in quotations because I think that is once again, I see her as being, for what I see in math, I think she would be really strong in science. So there's a lot to unpack there. She does seem to say that art and music and the kind of more creative types of courses, she doesn't see herself as strong in those courses. Doesn't always seem to be engaged. She did mention interpersonal and people, like sometimes she is very direct, and which can kind of contradict her being good with people. But what I see on a daily basis is, even though she's direct, she has she's definitely a leader, and people do tend to gravitate toward her. So I put interpersonal and people for weakness only because those were mentioned in the surveys, but that's not what I've personally witnessed. All right, so now what? What does this mean? How do I meet Maddie's needs in my classroom? Definitely, I try to have a warm, enriching environment, an environment where students are going to work hard and take risks and be open, just putting it all out there, which I know in a math class can be stressful. But she has years, other than her 9th grade year, she's always felt comfortable and confident in her math courses. So that makes it easier to kind of help to build that environment in those classes with students who have had generally good experiences with math, their math classes. She has a lot of opportunities to get her hands on the work, to actually practice. I don't just lecture, so definitely meeting her needs in that respect. By nature, the accelerated courses are a challenging curriculum. A lot of times she does have the best teachers, meaning the teachers with a lot of experience. They're not new teachers. Teachers who have worked with gifted and accelerated students for years, so they kind of know what works and what doesn't work. And then, of course, once again, she's in a class of students who are highly motivated, and they're juniors, so I'm seeing kids who are getting ready for college, so of course they're motivated to, if nothing else, to keep their GPA up, but the vast majority of them really are like going beyond what the minimum is in class, doing a lot of extension activities, asking a lot of probing questions. So just her being in that environment is bringing her up, and then of course she's bringing others up as well. So that is, in a nutshell, Maddie, a case study of a gifted child, by Dr. Andrew B. Spires.